Hey, sixth graders. This next section, this is the third video in the history of the musicals that we're looking at. And this next section focuses in the first part of it on Showboat and why Showboat was such an important musical and how it changed what came after it. And you'll hear them talk about the history of the musical as being before Showboat and then after Showboat. And so with the advent of jazz and black musicians who were actually performing more on stage and started their own following, really changed the future of the musical. And I'm sure you're going to have a lot of questions after some of this, so you can either send me or Mr. Strasser some messages. But we hope you enjoy this next section. There's a lot of information in it, a lot of great clips. If you like old vaudeville type comedy, people like the Three Stooges or the Marx Brothers or Abbott and Costello and stuff like that, I'm sure you'll like some of the sections of this. Enjoy.
This is how to get them.
Hey, where do you think you're going? Don't you know this show is starting soon? Hey, just a few feet left here. It's light inside, outside there's no moon.
So this is a scene from the original production of Showboat, and again, you see how packed the actors and actresses were on stage. Very typical of these early musicals.
What for you gals dressed up sexy?
In November of 1926, Florenz Ziegfeld called his secretary Goldie into his office to take a letter.
Come on, folks, we're ready to go.
Last night I heard the first act of The Showboat and Jerome Kern's music. This is the best musical comedy I've ever been fortunate to get hold of. This show is the opportunity of my life. Florenz Ziegfeld.
The history of the American musical theater is divided quite simply into two eras, everything before Showboat and everything after Showboat.
It was composer Jerome Kern who first read Edna Ferber's novel about a Mississippi showboat. And he teamed with a 31-year-old writer named Oscar Hammerstein to turn her epic story into a musical.
They wrote most of the songs of the first act and brought them to Ziegfeld. Who else would you bring them to? He was God. He was the greatest producer of his time. And he was the only man they felt who had the vision and the power and the influence to be able to put it on. Ziegfeld at once leaped to do it.
Showboat was really a step for him that was terrifying. And he loved doing it, and to begin with, it was rather a sad story, and he said, we cannot do this musical with all this sadness. And he was so afraid that people would not like what he was doing because they expected a Follies. They expected laughter and ha-ha and beautiful girls.
It was seismic then, that's for sure. The earth shook. There was this incredible centerpiece of a scene in the first act, the miscegenation scene, which had about 8 leading characters, all interrelating, no songs, and an incredibly complex political plot about miscegenation.
I understand that you have a miscegenation case on board.
What do you mean, Mom?
How's that? A case of a Negro woman married to a white man. A criminal offense in this state. Julie Dozier, my information says you were born in Mississippi. Your pop was white, your mammy black. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
You two better get your things and come along with me.
So it's hard to believe that this was actually a law back then, that it was illegal for a black woman to be married to a white man. You know, we're not saying that people frowned upon it. It was actually a law that made it illegal, and people were arrested for it.
The lyricist and book writer Oscar Hammerstein chose not to whitewash Ferber's powerful stories, which played out on Captain Andy's showboat, the Cotton Blossom, as it traveled up and down the Mississippi for decades.
So this is a beautiful shot of the set, and you see how complex the set is on the stage, how they tried to make it look like real trees and look like a real showboat in the background. And that's the difficulty of doing a show on stage in front of a live audience, is trying to create the concept of something actually existing on the stage and make the audience believe that you're there watching this.
I think that before we opened, Ziegfeld expected Showboat to be a pretty big bore, and he thought all that story stuff would be cut out. And what would remain would be the pretty costumes and scenery and the tunes and the girls and the comedian. But I wanted to keep the spirit of Edna's book. It was a sprawling kind of novel. And the one focal influence I could find was the river, the Mississippi. So I decided to write a river theme.
Old Man River, that old man River, he must know something, but don't say nothing. He just keeps rolling, he keeps on rolling along.
What Oscar Hammerstein did, I think, primarily was to marry European operetta and American musical comedy tradition. And Showboat is the apotheosis of that, in which you tell a story, but unlike European operetta, a serious story, or a story that has some realism, if you want to use such a word. And I think that one of the reasons Showboat turned out as well as it did is that Kern knew what Oscar was trying to do, and he was just as interested in doing it.
I'm tired of living and scared of dying, but old man River, he just keeps rolling along.
Showboat docked in New York on December 27th, 1927. At the stunning new Ziegfeld Theater. The producer had given his audience everything his name had stood for over 2 decades. But this time, there was a story, an American story. And the Broadway book musical had reached its first milestone.
But when it opened and the curtain went down, there was absolute silence. And he said, well, now I've really done it.
Hammerstein, who directed it, had done something very revolutionary. The curtain went down at the end and never went up for curtain calls. There were no curtain calls in the original production. So the audience didn't know what to do. And they applauded politely and walked out into the night.
And this was such a strange thing to have happen. Today, when you go see a musical, at the end of it, the cast comes back out for curtain calls, starting with the least important characters, the characters in the ensemble, and working their way up to the lead of the musical, who usually is the female role, but sometimes in the case of a show like Hamilton would be the male role. And then the entire cast will take a bow and acknowledge the orchestra. And then the curtain will close a second time at the end, and that'll be the end of it. So take a moment to talk about this. How many of you have been to a live musical or live show before where there's been a curtain call? And how many of you have been in a show where there's been a live curtain call?
And Ziegfeld was convinced he had a failure until the following morning when the reviews came out.
Suddenly, the musical could say something with an integrity that it hadn't quite said before.
So I just want to pause as you look at this ticket here at the prices. The ticket price is $1 to $5 per seat. And they talk about, no raising the prices except on New Year's Eve. But when we compare that to modern musicals today, that even in Rochester will go for anywhere from $60 to $150, per seat, and then if you get a show like Hamilton, you'll find ticket prices that are $400, $500 to $1,000 per seat. When Hamilton was on Broadway and Lin-Manuel Miranda was finishing up his run, tickets were selling for $10,000 to $20,000 per seat, which is absolutely crazy.
Thanks to Kern, thanks to Hammerstein, thanks to the performers, but mostly thanks to Ziegfeld, who made it possible. But it was a hard act to follow.
As a producer, Florenz Ziegfeld had guided the Broadway musical to maturity. But the triumph of Showboat could not be repeated. Over the course of the 1920s, the songwriters Ziegfeld hired and the performers he engaged would become far more powerful than Ziegfeld himself. Their celebrity, trumpeted by technology in the new media age, would extend well beyond the confines of the theater district and bring the Broadway musical to every corner of the nation.
Wait a minute. You ain't heard nothing yet. Wait a minute, I tell you. You ain't heard nothing.
So this new technology that was coming along was talking pictures, where they could actually record sound and video at the same time and show that to the audiences with sound. This was pretty amazing stuff for back then, and we'll get into that a little bit in the next section.
Next, Broadway teaches the country to sing and dance during the Roaring '20s.
Broadway becomes the popularizer of the new, the modern.
The Charleston, jazz, and the new American slang. It's all on Broadway, the American musical. This is the Shubert Theater on 44th Street, the home of the famous producers who helped to make the 1920s the most prodigious decade in Broadway history. In the Jazz Age, New York was the syncopated city, and Broadway was the Big Apple, the goal of all ambition. You could see Al Jolson and the Marx Brothers on stage, and songwriters like the Gershwins and Rodgers and Hart created fascinating rhythms. Thanks to the power of the press and the arrival of radio and talking pictures, everyone in America could hear the seductive siren song of Broadway.
Goodbye. Good, don't cry. The little future train that takes me away from you. You don't know just how sad it makes me. Kiss me pretty and then, ow, do it over again. Watch for the mail, I'll never fail. If you don't get a letter, then you know I'm in jail. Hey, don't cry, Tootsie, don't cry. Kiss me, Tootsie, goodbye.
Broadway in the 20s was a showcase for the sweeping changes that transformed American culture. New York was the mecca of the Jazz Age, and Broadway was its glamorous shrine, a place where fame was first manufactured.
Goodbye, Tootsie, goodbye.
The 20s are a time of incredibly rapid change, really quick modernization. And this is the decade in which Broadway and the musical theater are in many ways at the height of their influence.
A tremendously rich, exciting time in the theater. You know, in 1927, you have 250 shows opening, 50 of them musicals, and you have over 20 million people going to the theater, probably more than double what we have today.
From 1920 to 1929, you were really sitting on a rainbow. Everything was lovely.
So before we get into this next section, the key point here is the reason why musicals were so much more popular and so many more theaters and so many more people went to them back then was because there was no other form of entertainment. There was no television. Radio was just coming out, and a lot of people couldn't afford new radios. So in order to get entertainment, you would have to go to the theater to actually see it. So this is the era of Prohibition, where alcohol was illegal, and so they destroyed all the alcohol in all the bars and nightclubs and places in New York City. People would come to the shows, and they would have something to eat and have something to drink. And so this was a big step for what happened in the history of the Broadway musical.
A new era on Broadway began on January the 16th, 1919, when the sale of alcohol was outlawed in New York.
The night before Prohibition is enacted in New York, people do run wild. They run around with bottles and baby carriages. You know, they are buying every last bottle that they possibly can to store. They really think the supply of liquor is going to run out. What developed instead was that New York really led the nation in the carelessness of its enforcement of Prohibition.
We have 3,200 speakeasies on Broadway.
So these speakeasies were these clubs where they would have illegal alcohol, and they would have secret knocks that you would knock on the door, and they'd have these little windows that would open up so people inside could see who was knocking on the outside and decide whether or not to allow people to come in.
3,200 speakeasies between 42nd and 55th Street.
5'2", eyes of blue, but oh, what those 5 foot should do. Has anybody seen my girl? Turned up nose, turned down hole.
This is a very creative period for language. You had passwords at speakeasies. Classes were now mingling, and they were mingling with the underworld because everybody was breaking the law.
Upstairs, boys. What's that elevator? Make it down. Stay here. Hold on, everybody. Stay right here.
And the music of the 1920s, jazz, really caused the beat of a new age. And the songs that are coming out of Broadway really are registering this kind of shift in the American sensibility.
Audiences fell in love with Cinderella stories, musical comedies in which the main character might be a dishwasher in Act 1, but marry the man of her dreams just before the final curtain.
Many of the musicals were about women. There was a show called Mary, there was a show called Irene, there was a show called Sally. And then someone said, let's do a show called Sally, Irene, and Mary. And there was a musical with that title. You had to have a girl's name or some reference to a girl in the show.
She was almost always Irish, a good-hearted poor orphan who used slangy banter to win the hand of her millionaire suitor. In 1920, Florence Ziegfeld showcased his all-American Cinderella in a new show with music by Jerome Kern. By the time the curtain fell on Sally, their spunky heroine had become a Follies star, just as Marilyn Miller had in real life.
Every star on Broadway is a testament to pluck and luck and achievement and all the values that come with the package of the American dream.
Just think, tomorrow night I'm going to get a chance to dance in front of a real audience.
Our culture is a cultural optimism, and what the musical sells is optimism.
Sure, I'm glad.
Your dreams came true on Broadway. You go to a Broadway show and your dreams came true. You go back to Williamsburg or Brownsville or the Bronx and your dreams don't come true.
The 20s on Broadway was an age of wonderful nonsense. Audiences wanted to have a good time, and musical comedy did not rely on memorable stories. For 50 cents, you could get a ticket to see the zany antics of the Marx Brothers live.
Did someone call me Snorra?
So that is Groucho Marx, and if you have seen at Halloween time, they have usually in the costume department, they have a pair of eyeglasses attached to a nose with a big mustache under it, and that's what it was modeled after, was Groucho Marx.
He went into the jungles where all the monkeys throw nuts.
If I stay here, I'll go nuts. Say, don't you see there are ladies present? What do you think this is? Put that hat down, will you?
Hey, what do you do there? Get out of here.
The idea of a musical was you have a funny story or a silly story or a star vehicle, something that shows off your stars, and you have a comedy scene, and then you have a song and or a dance number.
The quintessential show of the 1920s was the revue. The musical revues of that period were a representation of the pluralism of American life. They captured a little bit of everything.
They were not musicals the way we think of them today, where there's a story and actors playing characters. They were loosely structured revues that featured songs and also the stars.
It's really disgusting.
Oh, it's terrible.
I'm sorry that you had to see this.
That's all right.
Now, stand clear and keep your eye on the ball.
Most of the shows were almost entirely frivolous little stories. A woman named Maud, and a man named Claude. And then you'd never hear from them again in the next skit, because the next skit, Bert Lahr was in.
Well, what about it? What about it?
So Bert Lahr played the lion in The Wizard of Oz. If you've seen that, you'll recognize his style of voice and style of character.
That's what you call 2-in-1. 2-in-1. It's a suit and an overcoat combined. You like a suit like this?
I like a blue sage with a white stripe.
With a white... Oh, with a stripe. With a stripe. Say what you want. There you...
Wait a minute. You're trespassing.